Today, we're going to take a look at how to take an SVG file, say a logo or an icon, take it into Blender and use geometry nodes to control the final 3D shape. Hey, this is Richard from BlenderGrid.com. Let's jump into Blender, remove everything, and take a look at a SVG file that I have. And there's two ways you can import SVG files into Blender. I'm going to first show the way that we're not going to use, but it might be interesting for some use cases. So this first way is simply by dragging it into Blender. We will import it as a grease pencil object, I believe. And we have a little bit of control over the resolution and scale here, but I'm just going to import that. And this is what it looks like. Let's focus in on this. And you can see the gaps are not working, but if we look at the information is still there. And as you can see, we have this grease pencil object, and it's kind of interesting. I never used the grease pencil, so I'm not too familiar with it, but it might be useful in some use cases. However, we don't have much control over this object using geometry nodes, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to delete that and use the second way we can import an SVG file, which is by going to File, Import, and then choose SVG. And here we can import our SVG file. And for this example, I just used the Blender Grid logo, which looks good. It imports everything properly even with the materials. Although it's a little bit small. So what I'm going to do is select everything and just scale it up by 20 times so that it kind of matches the regular Blender object sizes. And the other thing I want to do is just to apply the scale. It's not necessary, but now we just have a clean start with a scale of 1. And that's cool. So now we have our SVG file in Blender. And if we tap into edit mode, we can see these are the Bezier curves. This is just a curve object. And so we have the Blender Grid text as a single object. We have the icon and the tagline. And let's go over to the geometry nodes view and take this and let's start with the Blender Grid text. And the video I did a few years ago about taking text and controlling the topology is this kind of a similar technique. So let's, with this selected, start a new geometry nodes setup, and this will automatically create a geometry nodes modifier and activates our nodes over here. So right now we can see the material because it added faces. Blender added faces inside of the shapes of our paths in a way. And if we look in geometry nodes, and when you look at this view over here, we can see we have some mesh data going on. And that's kind of weird because this is a path. And so why do we see mesh data and we see 0 curves? That's because the curve shape is set to 2D, which is a useful way to view logos and flat paths that are kind of going in the X and Y direction, but not in the Z direction, which is only 2-dimensional. This allows you to immediately see everything and apply material to it by filling in the shape. But if we want to have more control over it with geometry nodes, we have to set the shape to 3D, and this removes the color, this removes the fill. But now we have more control with geometry nodes because now we can see we don't have this mesh anymore, but now we have our curve. We have 18 splines and 122 control points. And now we have a way to do everything we want with geometry nodes. So let's start with this first object. And let's start by applying, let's start with a curve operation, which is fill curve. And that's kind of the same thing that the shape setting it to 2D does. But instead now you can see the default Blender material is added and we kind of lost our black color. And that's something I'm gonna fix later. But for now, we already have a little bit more control than what Blender does, because if we set this to 2D and we look at the topology, it looks pretty hideous. And setting this to 3D does almost the same thing, but now we can set it to n-gons, and this looks a lot less messy. And this is a similar thing I did in the tutorial where I did this with the regular Blender text object. But we can do the same thing with our SVG because it just turns it into curves. So that's already pretty nice. If we want to take a look at our topology while working with this in solid view, we can turn on our wireframe. So let's do that and turn the opacity down by maybe to 0.4. So now we can see a little bit more of the wireframe. And as you can see, setting it to 2D kind of creates all these triangles, and n-gons are a little bit cleaner in this case, but it depends on what you want to do with the mesh at the end. So here we can flip between triangles and n-gons. The next step I want to do is kind of make this 3D. So without geometry nodes, you could do this with some modifiers, but geometry nodes gives you a little bit more control. It's also a little bit more work to set it up, but it's not too bad. So let's go. With this fill curve, we kind of turned our curve or multiple curves into mesh objects, and or it's a single mesh actually, and it's just connected like this. So with this mesh, what we can do is extrude it. So let's see if we can find this. If not, you can search for it. Here we go. Extrude mesh. All right. So when you apply this, the standard offset is 1, which is a little bit much. Let's lower it to 0.1. And now we have some 3D text. And it's only... if you want to view this only from the front, it's fine. But as you can see from the back, it doesn't fill in anything here. So it just extrudes our faces upwards and it creates sides. But it also creates sides internally. And this is mostly apparent when you set this back to triangles. You can see there's a lot of geometry inside of here that we don't really care about. So in order to prevent that from happening, we can turn off individual in the extrude mesh node. And now we just have a clean extrusion of our shapes. And that already looks good. We can set it back to n-gons. And now we have something like this. And if we want to fill in the back as well, we can simply join this shape with the original faces. So the way to do that is using a join node and join geometry. And we can place this here, and we can take this and join it with the original mesh, and that gives us this. And now this part, let me give it another color. Quick way to do that is to set the material. So let's set the material of the original, and we don't set the material of the extruded mesh. And let's set it to black. So now you can see this black part is not really connected to the extruded mesh. And the way to connect that is to merge these, to merge this mesh by distance. And there's a node for that as well. Let's merge by distance, and the default distance of 0.001 is fine. And it looks like nothing happened, but if you turn this off and you look in the mesh properties here, you can see we lower the amount of vertices, edges by a lot, because we started with points and edges from the black part and from the white part kind of laying on top of each other, and now with this node they're merged together and stuck together, and that makes it a nicer mesh. All right, now this is something you could have gotten without geometry nodes. Let me remove this material, just have this single mesh now. But one thing I would like to do is, if we look at this this L, we almost have no topology, and that might be a good thing, but it also, if we say want to take this mesh and deform it, we don't have enough topology in this L shape to do anything with it. Let's say we want to curve it or something, that there's no way to do that nicely because this is just a single edge between two vertices. So there are two ways to add more topology. And I'm just going to show both, and they both have pros and cons. So we want to control this at the curve level. So in this connection between the first two nodes, this is where our geometry is still a curve, and after this it becomes a mesh. So we want to do something where it's still a curve. And so let's look at the curve nodes. And in the operations, I want to, the first way is to resample the curve. And there is a bunch of ways we can do this. If we apply this right here, the resolution becomes really low, and we kind of screw up our entire logo. But it might be a cool effect you want to go for if that's, if that's what you want to go for. The default is set to count, and it's set to 10. And now every curve, I believe, gets only 10 segments. And it's kind of evenly distributed. And if we set it back to evaluate it, we go back to the original result, which if you turn this off, there's no difference. And then the other option is length, where you get a constant length of a segment. And if we set this length to something like 0.02, we got something pretty nice and a very evenly distributed topology. And now if you look at the L, we have a lot of points across this straight line. And that is very useful if we want to deform this at a later stage. So that's cool. The downside, however, of this method is that all the sharp corners kind of become rounded, because what we try to do is take every curve and we just add little line segments with a constant length, and they don't necessarily line up with all the corners. So as you can see here, this corner is not, it's kind of rounded, and we have to go very small if we want to avoid that. And even with 0.01, we can see the corner is not perfect. And that might not be an issue if this is like, if you want to use this text for something like 3D printing, then this, at some point, the resolution or this small imperfection doesn't really matter. But for other things, it might matter. So as you can see here, this sharp corner in the E is now kind of rounded off, and as well as here. And you don't have much control over how it rounds and where, because it just happens to line up or not line up. So that's one way to control the topology. The downside is the corners are not perfect. The good thing about this method is that all the line segments have a kind of a constant length. So that's nice. Okay, let's look at the other option. And we go into curve again, and we want to write to the curve data by setting the spline type. And we can change the spline type. And again, We lower the resolution a lot by default, but that's because it's set to poly. Another one is Cadmial ROM, which is an interesting effect where you kind of have the same as poly, but then it applies some kind of subdivision surface modifier on top of that. But the one I want to go for is NURBS, and the Bezier one currently is exactly the same as what it was. This is no change, no difference. If you turn this off, it's exactly the same. But this node allows us to set it to NURBS, which kind of adds a lot of points also on the L shape across this straight line. So that's what we want to go for. And also the other benefit is that all the corners look perfect because it kind of subdivides every line segment in a constant amount of segments. Instead of using a constant length, it uses a constant amount of segments. So over here, the density is way higher than over here. So the longer segments get less density this way. That's the downside. And you can clearly see this here, where this segment is very short and this segment is longer. So the density is lower here. And another node I want to use this with is setting the spline resolution. And this is something you can set over here, which is the default is 12, and you can change that over here. But if you want to have more control, you can set it in geometry nodes, and we can set it here, or we can set it before going into the spline type. Doesn't really matter. And by default it's set to 12, so that doesn't change anything. But we can change this and maybe lower this to something like 4, and that looks like enough geometry to make these letters look smooth. And now we have a lot more points to work with across this all the straight line segments. So that's the option I would go for in this case, but it all depends on what you want to do with the text or with the logo. So that gives us some control over the topology, and this would allow us to kind of bend the text. And maybe in a separate video, a sequel to this one, I want to take this shape and maybe emboss another object with this or engrave it into some other object. And geometry nodes are a perfect tool to do stuff like that. So now we have done this to one of our 3 objects. Well, before I'm going to apply it to the other objects, I'm going to fix the material. So there is a way to set the material with geometry nodes with the set material node, and we can just do that here and set it to the black material that it's supposed to be. And that works, but I don't really need... Well, this allows you to set the material individually on separate parts of the geometry. I don't really need that kind of control in this case, so I'm going to delete that node. And there is another way you can do it by going into the material settings of the object. And currently we can see there is this black material set to the text, and it's supposed to look black, but we don't see it. So if you look at the viewport display, the color is black and it doesn't show up. So why is that? Currently, this material is set to the object data, or yeah, the data of the object, which is, you can also see it in the outliner. This is the object, and this green one is the object data, the actual curve. And under that, you can see the material. And the object data is what we kind of destroy with geometry nodes, because that comes in here and we set some properties on the object data, but then we turn it into a mesh and we create brand new data which the material is not applied to anymore. So this new mesh has no material applied to it, even though we have set it here. This material is only set at the data that comes in here. So there is another way to apply this material. So we can remove it from the object, and now you can see it's not not there anymore. And we can set this at the object level instead. And now if we select the black material again, now you can see it works, because now the material is set at the object level. So it just takes whatever faces this object has at the end of the geometry nodes. That's kind of how I see it. And then it applies the material to that. So this just applies it to everything, which is kind of what I want to go for. So let's rename this to black, and now that works. And yeah, in the outliner, you can now see that the data doesn't have any material, but the material is directly set on the object. So that's another way to make it work. But if you want to have more control, you can also do it with geometry nodes and set the material there, or set it only to the top faces or something, or the side. All right, let's take this now, and I'm gonna rename this node setup to, what it does is pretty much takes a path and it turns it into 3D. So path to 3D. And yeah, it takes a path, extrudes it, and yeah, turns it into a 3D mesh. So I want to apply the same geometry node setup to the other two parts of the logo. So let's take the tagline, and now we can just add a modifier, choose geometry nodes, and then select our path to 3D, and that does exactly what we need. And actually, this doesn't do exactly what we need. So let's take a look at this. We don't have the clean n-gons at the top faces, and we also have a way too high resolution over here, and we don't have that resolution over here. Why is that? We can already see some warnings over here. And that's because we forgot to set to turn the shape into 3D. Because right now we're not really able to control this with geometry nodes. It still kind of works, which is pretty cool. It shows how robust geometry nodes are, because right now the geometry that comes in is already a mesh. So setting this spline resolution and setting the spline type doesn't do anything, and then filling the curve doesn't do anything either. But we pretty much take this mesh and then extrude it and join it back to the original. And that's why you can see it still kind of works. But if you set this to 3D, now we have the proper topology. And now we break the material again, because the material is set to the data instead of to the object. But now you can see this, this kind of fixes our topology. So here we have some topology, some points to work with, and the n-gons are working. So let's fix the material. So instead of this is kind of confusing, but if you set the material, if you just select, you leave it here, and then select object, and then select your black material again, you can see it's kind of linked twice, one at the data level and one at the object level. And if you click on them, it also switches this this setting over here in the material. So that's kind of confusing, and that kind of breaks, just selecting it here breaks the material. So that's something to be aware of. And if you want to avoid that, you can just remove the material from the data like that. And now we have a similar way as we did with the Blender grid text. It's only set to the object and not linked to the data anymore. Okay, cool. That works. Now let's do the same thing with our little icon here. And we add the geometry nodes, select our path to 3D. That extrudes it, but it doesn't fix any topology. So to do that, we have to set the path to 3D. That fixes the topology, breaks the material. So let's fix the material by, let's first rename this to blue. And then I'm going to remove it from the data, select the object, and add it like that. And that gives us a pretty good starting point for turning a SVG logo into a 3D shape using geometry nodes. And with that, I'm going to save the file. And I will save this blend file if you want to follow along or copy the node setup. I will save this blend file, make it available for download. I'll also make the SVG available for download so you can follow along. But I would encourage you to try it with your own SVG. And I'll probably do a next video about this where I will cover taking this and doing something interesting with it. Probably combining it with another object, like embossing it or engraving it into another object using geometry nodes. So if you have any questions about anything I did here, feel free to leave a comment. If you have any suggestions to go to the next level from here that you would like me to cover, also feel free to leave a comment. I'm always looking for new ideas. And with that, I will see you in the next one.